This is the third in-person memorial event that we've been able to organize for my father. The first two were in 2021 between different waves of the pandemic. And so, of course, we were able to host only a very limited group. But we are very glad to be able to open up today's session to that many more people this year. The germ of the idea for this event came from last year's book fair. And that was when, at an event organized by the Russian consulate and Devoshmita Maulik, who may join us today, we first got to see Afra's presentation on Soviet children's literature. And we were so impressed that we realized we had to showcase this before a larger audience and also with its full scale. So that really is the reason that we felt we had to bring her back. And of course, my father's memorial event, his interest in Soviet studies and history, all proved to be a great fit. We also will have a video from Jessica Bachman, who's a scholar in the subject, but she is unable to, of course, physically be here today. But she sent a lovely video, which we will play in a bit. Jessica's work, of course, looks at the foreign language print publishing program by which the Soviet Union extended its cultural reach and impact in the Cold War years. And Afra's project is much more focused on Soviet children's literature that traveled to and within India in the period from the 1960s to the 1980s. Given Afra's background in design, in multimedia art and filmmaking, she's of course transformed this into a video game, which is as much an act of speculation and fantasy as it is a historical and archival project of bringing together books, writers, illustrators, publishers and translators who played an integral role in what we today think of as Soviet children's literature. The other thing that I must highlight over here is this creative engagement with the archives, because one of my endeavors in keeping alive Baba's legacy is to look into the number of interdisciplinary interests he had, and this was not really necessarily within academia but also outside of it. So of course there's his love for music, which we celebrated in the first tribute event, and then there's his love for food, for films, and of course for children's literature, which he passed down to me and to a number of his students actually. So, but at the heart of today's evening lies the act of storytelling, which is of course the first way in which children bond with parents and grandparents, and that's also our introduction to the world. Like many other parents, Baba read out several books to me, and I've picked a selection and kept it out there in the reading corner. But of course, there weren't enough Soviet children's literature in my selection, which is why I then reached out to many guests to bring along bits and pieces from their home libraries and collections. And there's one special book, of course, that Baba did gift to me and which I brought along here. I'm going to put it out there for display in a bit, and I'm going to read an extract from it as well. The idea is to remember all the books that were as much a part of my childhood as my father's childhood, and also all the children's literature that he picked up in his travels with me. So many of the books outside would include Rupert Bear, Babar the Elephant, the Just Williams series, and the Billy Bunter series. In fact, one of the last books that Baba was reading before he left us was a Billy Bunter. So, but some of these might be slightly unfamiliar because they're also very rooted in European, British, and French contexts and upbringings. But of course, there's Tintin, there's Joe and Zetty, there's Lucky Luke, which so many of us have already read and also know of through translations in Bengal. Baba also saw these books as an early way of introducing history to me. For instance, the stories and independent struggles of the Balkan states through the mythical country of Sildavia, which is mentioned in King Ottokar's scepter. But he also taught me how to have fun with history. For instance, in one of the William stories, William is trying to figure out what to bring along for a show and tell session in school. And this is related to history, of course. And suddenly he picks up a comb which his sister Ethel has left behind somewhere. And, he throws in some dust and puts some cobwebs on it, and then he takes it to school, and he merrily makes a story out of this object as an ancient artifact that he found in a playground while he was with his friends. So, of course, we all know of the dangers of revising and rewriting history, but I really want to focus today on the fun that can be had of it and the creative possibilities. History ultimately comes down to a form of storytelling, and there's nothing quite as convincing as a tale told well. On that note, let us commence today's session with an extract from the book that Baba gifted me. It's a picture book. I'm going to try and hold it up, but I'm also going to put it out there for you to see. And I will request you to remember some of these words, characters, and motives who are sure to come alive in Afra's presentation. Nobody knows for certain. There's seats. Please feel free to come up. Okay. So this is from Alexander Pushkin's Wonder Bay. Near Wonder Bay, there grows an oak tree. A chain of gold upon it glows. And day and night around that oak tree, a learned cat a walking goes. When it goes right, it starts a story. When it goes left, a song it sings. A goblin prowls there, wild and hoary. A mermaid on the branches swings. Upon the sand of hidden pathways lie tracks of creatures unbeknown. On chicken feet there stands a cottage. No doors, no windows, bare and lone. Through hill and dale their elves go roaming. At early dawn the waves come foaming. And 30 knights, a sight to see, come marching from beneath the sea. And with them on the seashore sandy, their old sea chieftain is seen standing. A valorous young prince in passing takes captive a despotic czar, hardly domestic. And in the clouds above the castle, a wizard bears a warrior far. In gloom a princess pines away there, and Grey Wolf serves her night and day there. The mortar of the wicked witch stalks by itself over dike and ditch. King Skeleton shakes over gold there. Of Russia smells the air of old there. I was there too, and drank strong brew. By Wonder Bay, by waters blue. Beneath the green-leaved oak I sat, and listened to the learned cat. So this is Alexander Pushkin, Wonder Bay, prologue to the poem Ruslan and Ludmilla, designed and illustrated by Sergei Yakovlev, translated from the Russian by Dorian Rottenberg, Mailish Publishers, Moscow, printed in the USSR in 1987. On that note, I'm going to ask Ma to introduce Jessica and Afra, and then we'll play Jessica's video and we'll let Afra take over the evening.
It's not a memorial occasion. I like to believe that Hari is somewhere with us, and he would have taken an active role in organizing this with me. And I also want to mention that Hari got on as well with people much older than him. And our guest of honor today is Ruby Pal Chaudhary. Hari was like a son to her, and she's here with us. But Hari got on equally well with people much, much younger. And I think he bonded, therefore, across generations. So I think it's a special pleasure to have two very young people, one of whom knew him briefly, Jessica, do this event. And I'm sure Hari would have taken an active role in organizing this with me. It's also special that both Jessica and Afra have a link with this institution and this very building. Afra began her career, or not began, sorry, she had a career before that, but one of the very important work she did came out of an archival project linked here. And I first met Jessica as part of a workshop here where she presented her work, as did many others here. So Jessica is in Ecuador on vacation. She can't join us on Zoom. So she has sent a short video laying a larger context. I'll briefly introduce her. Jessica is currently completing her dissertation at the Department of History, University of Washington at Seattle, where she's examining how the Soviet Union sought to win over hearts and minds in the decolonizing world during the Cold War through foreign language print publishing initiatives. With a focus on the circulation and reception of Soviet print media in India, her work challenges the conventional narratives that depict the Soviet Union's cultural performance abroad during the Cold War as a failure. Instead, by tracing the foreign activities and ambitions of the USSR's largest foreign language press, Progress Publishers, and the enigmatic book export agency Mezhnega, she shows how the USSR achieved unparalleled cultural success in India, which became the largest consumer of Soviet texts outside the socialist bloc by the early 1970s. An important argument of her work is that Soviet books played a significant role in democratizing access to education, technical scientific knowledge, and literacy in India, at a time when economic inequities, entrenched social hierarchies, and chronic scarcity impose barriers to the widespread realization of these social goods. Jessica's held several fellowships, but with a strong commitment to public scholarship and digital history, she has launched something called Bollywood and Bolsheviks, Indo-Soviet Collaboration in Literature and Film, 1954 to 1991, which was an exhibit initially in the libraries of the University of Washington, but this project now has involved also the development of an oral history archive and documentary films, and has been screened and selected at the 3rd International Film Festival. I'll go on to Afra, who, as I said, we first met when she had a fellowship along with Shujan here. She's a multimedia artist based out of Goa, India. Using the process of research as an artistic playground, she intertwines archival findings, history, memory, folklore, and fantasy to create a speculative world born of remixed cultures. Her work moves across various mediums, drawing from the handmade language of traditional folk forms and connecting them to the digital language of the internet and video games. She also works as a teacher, illustrator, animator, video editor, and producer in various projects in the world of documentary film, visual arts, and the internet. Her earlier prize-winning production, titled Sultana's Reality, had been shown at several global art events and was based on an archival fellowship with the IFA that she had at our institution's visual archives, and made wonderful animations out of a diverse range of women's images in our archives. Her next work she will talk about, so I will leave that to her. But it came out of a field research fellowship at the Garage Museum of Contemporary Art in Moscow, and where she began archiving children's books from the Soviet era that were abundant in India in a series of local languages during the Cold War years. Afra is here from the Dhaka Art Summit, where she showed this work, nobody knows for certain. But through an award of a fellowship through the Swiss Arts Council in India, she was also commissioned to collaborate with a Swiss architect and work on a large architectural installation, her first, along with a video on the theme of an ant hill and a kingdom of ants. Shujan has collaborated with her on the project. So Afra has moved from graphic animation to becoming an installation artist. So we are delighted to have Afra with us today, but we'll begin with a short video that Jessica has sent us, and we will then move on to Afra's presentation. So, once again, thank you all for being here.
In August 2015, after finishing my summer course in Bangla at the American Institute of Indian Studies in Kolkata, I went to visit Professor Hari Vasudevan at the Alipur campus of the University of Calcutta. I had just finished my master's program at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I was beginning to dip into what is now my dissertation topic on the production and circulation of Soviet books in India during the second half of the 20th century. But I was not at all confident in this choice of topic. Some American historians I had spoken with were not impressed with this avenue of inquiry. Well, that was all just propaganda. The Soviets' intentions were clear. So what? They would remark, leaving me feeling disparaged and discouraged. Dr. Vasudevan saw my topic differently and gave me the boost of encouragement and intellectual companionship that I needed to once again regain confidence in my ideas. He helped me contextualize the Soviet book project within a much longer history of Indo-Soviet relations. He challenged me to rethink certain assumptions and helped me refine my guiding questions. During this meeting, Dr. Vasudevan also gifted me his co-authored book that inventories the collections of different Soviet archives and their holdings on topics related to Indian history and Indo-Soviet relations. I am very much indebted to Dr. Vasudevan for the kindness he showed toward me as a PhD and master's student, and I am honored to be with you here virtually to sketch out some of the contours of the Soviet book project in India and to set the context for Afra Shafiq's innovative and engaging video game art. During the second half of the 20th century, Soviet publishing houses translated and published more texts in more languages and in higher print runs than any other publishers in the world. I find it useful to break this massive Soviet foreign language print empire into two parts. On the one hand, you have the millions of publications that the USSR translated into foreign languages and distributed abroad for free. Falling under this category would be the brochures, pamphlets, and small pocket-sized softcover books produced by the massive Novosti Press Agency, and also by the information and cultural departments of Soviet foreign embassies. The Novosti Press Agency's logo is here on the slide on the left. And on the other hand, you have Soviet books, magazines, and journals that were bought and sold abroad on commercial book marketplaces. At the center of this second pillar of global Soviet book distribution efforts was the USSR's book export agency named Международная книга, or Mezhkniga for short, and its logo is the MK on the right-hand side of the screen. Mezhkniga purchased the foreign language translations published by Soviet foreign language publishing houses at a discount and then sold them to a massive network of third-party booksellers around the world. And these booksellers in turn sold them to either their own networks of sub-agents or directly to consumers. India was, by the early 1960s, Mezhkniga's largest consumer of Soviet books outside the socialist bloc. The majority of books that Mezhkniga bought and sold were published by the Soviet Foreign Languages Publishing House, one of the largest publishing houses in the world. Here on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see an image of the massive headquarters of the Foreign Language Publishing House in downtown Moscow, taken, I believe, in the early 1960s. In 1963, the press was renamed Progress Publishers, and the Progress Publishers logo with the satellite on it is displayed on the lower right-hand side of the screen. Progress Publishers began translating books into the languages of what the Soviets often called weakly developed or formerly colonized or oppressed countries in 1953, the same year of Stalin's death. And they began with the Indian languages of Hindi, Urdu, and Bangla, followed closely behind by Telugu, Tamil, Burmese, and Thai. In the early 1960s, it added the African languages of Swahili, Hausa, Amharic, as well as, of course, Vietnamese, Marathi, Punjabi, and Malayalam. By the early 1970s, this publishing house was releasing titles in all major Indian languages and some minor Indian languages as well. Historians of the Cold War generally assume that this rapid expansion of the USSR's global foreign language translation and publishing efforts was stimulated by what I like to call push factors, forces that compelled the Soviet Union to push its books out onto the world on a massive scale. These forces relate to a thaw in official attitudes towards cultural exchange with capitalist and mixed economy countries, which is nicely represented in this photograph of Nikita Khrushchev shaking hands with Pandit Nehru during his visit to the USSR in 1955. other push forces would include the emergence of an internationalist Soviet foreign policy, and most importantly, the party state's desire to counter growing US and European influence across newly decolonized and decolonizing regions of Asia and Africa. But the historical evidence presents a more complex picture. What I found in the Russian archives is that as early as 1952 and 1953, institutions and individuals in India began to make attempts to pull Soviet books, and in particular literary fiction and scientific and technical books, towards the south. A variety of Soviet institutions, from the Soviet Embassy and Trade Mission in Delhi to the Academy of Sciences and Foreign Affairs Ministry, and even the Soviet Writers' Union, began to receive in the early 1950s at first dozens, and then hundreds, and then thousands of requests for Soviet books to be translated into both Indian languages and into English. Taken together, all of these individual and institutional requests, which again were primarily for literary fiction and children's books as well as science books, prompted the Foreign Languages Publishing House, that is Progress Publishers, to seek party approval for the formation of the publisher's first Indian Languages Department in 1955. The approval for the formation of an Indian Languages Department, the first department in the publishing house that represented languages of Asia, of South Asia and Africa, was granted. But the publisher still faced a major problem. There was no one qualified in the Soviet Union at the time to translate books into Indian languages. So in 1956, the publisher convinced the Foreign Affairs Ministry to help recruit and then grant work visas to nearly 36 Indian translators. The first cohort of Indian translators arrived in Moscow to work for Progress Publishers in early 1957. And on the slide in front of you, you might recognize some of the Bengali translators. I believe all of the Indians represented in this photograph are Bengali, and they are Bengali. I would like to now turn to the question of Soviet book circulation in India. Once again, it's assumed that the USSR pushed its propaganda on Indian reading publics. In fact, the marketing and sales of Soviet literature in India was done almost entirely by Indian booksellers, publishing houses, agents, and book peddlers who worked for them on commission. In the 1950s, with a few exceptions, only those publishing outlets and booksellers affiliated with the Communist Party of India could sell Soviet-produced translations in India. One of these was the People's Publishing House in Delhi. And the People's Publishing House set up temporary exhibition stalls at major festivals and events throughout urban India in the 1950s to bring books to the public. On the screen here, you see an image of people gathered around a PPH bookstall at the Bombay International Industrial Fair in 1952. So it's already a crowded, energetic event here outside the PPH bookstall, but keep in mind that in 1952, the Soviet Union was not yet translating books into Indian languages, and so here the consumers would have been buying books in English. But by the early 1960s, the Soviet authorities, and Mezh-Kniga in particular, had grown increasingly frustrated with their party-affiliated book agents. They believed that these agents were only attracting committed communists and leftist fellow travelers. So Mezh-Kniga, the agency, began to increase its business with Indian bourgeois or capitalist booksellers. One of these was Bingsho Shatabdi, or 20th Century Book House, in Kolkata, which some of you might recognize. It was the largest Soviet book agent in Calcutta until the early 1980s. It had 108 sub-agents working for it just in the state of West Bengal. The images on this slide are of Bingsho Shatabdi's main showroom on Park Street. In the early 1980s, Bingsho Shatabdi was surpassed in sales volume by an upstart capitalist bookseller, which carried the Russian name Vostok, despite being founded and owned by a Bengali. The image before you captures the excitement and energy at one of Vostok's many temporary exhibitions of Soviet books. This one was at a boy mela in Assam in the mid-1980s. I regret that I do not have more time with you today to discuss Soviet book reception and circulation in India in more depth. All I have provided was the shortest of sketches. I will now turn it over to Afra to delve into the magic and delight that Soviet books brought to so many readers in late 20th century India. Thank you for your time.
I just want to start off by thanking Mrinalini and Tapati Di for having me here today. It feels very full circle because I think my very first experimental archive-based project happened with the CSSC, and it was really, really nice to have both Tapati Di's very words but also openness to allow me to play in ways that academia usually doesn't allow for. And I think that really led me on to a journey of making more works in the same approach and philosophy, and that's what led me here. And I think this is also like the most perfect and fitting place to talk about my work for the first time. So this is a project that started off in 2019 through a field research fellowship with a museum in Moscow called the Garage Center for Contemporary Art. And I'm actually not from the generation that grew up reading Soviet children's books. I think I missed the party by a couple of years. So I grew up with Enid Blyton's and, this sort of like more American and British writing. And I think I had a few Soviet books, but I didn't make that connection of this being a larger thing. But a couple of years back, I had met a writer in Bombay, a children's book writer in Bombay, who had quite a sizable collection of these Soviet children's books, and they just stayed with me because the imagery was gorgeous. It was just this most strikingly beautiful illustrations, and I just never forgot them somehow. And a few years later, when I was approached by this museum, and they asked me if I would like to do some kind of a field research which involved my country and Moscow. So it was sort of this Indo-Russian, but whatever you feel like doing. And I remembered those books, and I thought, okay, it might be nice to kind of delve into them and see what they're about. And then that's how I kind of tumbled down this rabbit hole and stayed there for about 2 years. I'm also really happy to speak right after Jessica because I think she's the only person who has been studying this world. And we've had many conversations through my project, and a lot of great and interesting findings for my project have also come through conversations with Jessica. So I don't want to spend too much time on the research part of it. I want to focus more on the play part of it, but I will take you through a little bit of what my findings were like. So one of the first things I realized was that because this was a state enterprise and the state itself no longer existed, there wasn't an existing body, archive, or institution for these books that existed in Moscow. And in India, there was this very fervid subculture of collectors who were just obsessed with collecting the titles, but mostly in their own mother tongues. So there wasn't an overall home for all of these children's books collections to live in. So I kind of began by, looking on the internet, and I joined all these Facebook groups called Fans of Russian Children's Books in Marathi, or, Russian Children's Books in Bengali. And it was amazing because it was mostly people in their 40s who grew up reading these books, who knew all of the titles, remembered the stories from their childhood, and were just obsessed with finding these titles. So they would be like, I have, Dunno in whatever, red cover Dunno, but I'm looking for purple color Dunno. And this would be the kind of conversation, or someone would, and it was really like stamp collectors. It wasn't very different from this like impulse of collecting. And often they would be like, oh, I have 2 of this, so does anyone want to swap with me? And this was the sort of dialogue and discourse around the children's books collections, and I just started reaching out to them informally and visiting their homes. So these aren't collectors in the way that we think of in the art world or in other kind of institutional logics. It's somebody has, is a CA, but also has 2 cartons under their bed, and that's their collection. So this is one of the first collections that I visited, which is of Kamgar Prakashan, the workers' publication in Burari. And this is sort of housed in an extra room on his terrace. And he had some of these he wasn't only interested in children's literature, he was very much involved with the party and with sort of the communist movement and turned to publication through that. So he had some of the very early titles. So for example, Lenin's writings that were published, like the first batch of Lenin's writings that were published, he had the first prints of them, etc. But also had a sizable collection of children's books, and is, if anyone's interested, the only place that still sells Soviet children's books. So he has a decent catalog where you can buy books for as cheap as 200 rupees even today. And then this is the second person I visited in this place called Ajivali in Ratnagiri, which was a really interesting place because, again, this was a village in Ratnagiri where most of the people had migrated to Bombay to work in the mills, and through the mills had kind of gotten involved with labor movements, and their children were then introduced to Soviet books as children growing up there. So the village was now mostly not inhabited by anyone because they'd all moved to Bombay, but they still housed the books because, of course, Bombay houses don't have space for these kind of book collections. But what was really interesting was in one of the houses, and this wasn't actually the only one, but in the kitchen there was a Lenin painting, a portrait, as you can see up there. And so very much their approach to the Soviet children's books came from an engagement with the idea of labor politics or communism. But then there were other collections. So on the left here was another place I visited in Wayanad, which was a library run by a person called Anil Limag. And he sort of grew up reading Gorky, and he talks about how when he read Gorky's Mother, it just changed his life. And he sort of, I think, also continues to imagine himself as a character in the book. He talks about how he wants to, like a book can really change and transform lives, and so he's really committed to building this space called AFRC, where he does English classes for children who don't really have access to English medium schools, and then also has this collection of very rare and fragile books that he allows them to read and play with under strict supervision. And then this was the second shelf that you see here is just a person who has an HR job but also has this big collection of books in Bombay, whose house I visited. And interestingly, he was very, very obsessed with the space books, this whole genre during the space race, which had a lot of books about the Soyuz Apollo mission or about, Alexei Leonov or Yuri Gagarin. So he kind of grew up with this idea of outer space being this magical place that human beings are now exploring. And as a child also wrote a letter to Alexei Leonov and in Marathi, because he read all of these books in Marathi, and he received a signed autograph of the cosmonaut in return. So there was this kind of dialogue that a lot of these readers had. Often they wrote letters to the publisher and they never went unanswered. So there were all of these sort of stories that came about. That's some of the process of archiving and photographing the books. So I just kind of began by photographing a selection of the books. And then through this, I also kind of ended up finding other memorabilia that a lot of the collectors had with them outside of the books. For example, this is a sticker that says Hindi Rusi Bhai Bhai. And then a lot of these stamps that, that kind of were part of the Indo-Soviet cultural exchange or friendship treaties. This was an interesting catalog of books that I found from 1981, and I've just put a little excerpt of a book sale in Calcutta. And just for today's presentation, I also pulled out covers of a few of the Soviet books in Bangla that I found through my collections. And you can see, over time, it wasn't only the fact that these books were being translated into all of these Indian languages, but also it was very much part of the design department to then incorporate typography, incorporate, so you never see a title just slapped there in a different Indian language. They were painted upon, they were designed within the logic of what the original was like. So these are some of the Bangla books that I just thought might be interesting to see. The one in the center is also it's the same title that Mrinalini read, Pushkin's. And Chuk and Gek, I think, is one of the most famous books that in Bangla, which apparently was constantly sold out. And so as I started kind of looking at these books, I was trying to understand for myself what I'm also kind of obsessed with categorizing and making subfolders and making, what are the themes, what are the overarching sort of patterns that you can see within a collection. And so when I was looking at these books, there were just somewhat like 4 very distinct categories of books that I started noticing repeatedly. And one of them were the folk tales, of course. So you had the fairy tales, the folk tales that came from all of the different parts of the Soviet Union. None of the books were very Russo-centric alone. So you had collections of tales that were from Ukraine or from the Baltic Empire or from Kazakhstan, or, so the folk tales were just obviously one very strong genre and largely untouched through right, starting from, I think, the 1958 was, when the first sort of children's books started coming in, up to the late 80s, they were largely untouched, except for this one subgenre that slowly starts emerging during the 70s, which a lot of scholars dub as fake lore, which is the taking of a folk tale and the changing of the characters to sort of reflect more ideas of this new nation that lives within this new ideal. So, for example, the story on the bottom right, Andrei the Mastermind, it's an existing Belarusian folk tale, and you see another title of it where the details aren't changed, but in this one, the evil serpent becomes the landlord, for example, right? Or you don't have the curse isn't that like in the original there is a curse that the serpent comes in and sucks these women's breasts, and then they no longer have milk to feed their children. But in this story, the landlord kind of charges too much and nobody has food to feed their children, for example. So it's the rewriting of a folk tale to kind of reflect ideas of class or ideas of, whatever the Bolshevik ideals were trying to kind of lay out in terms of the design of society. So the folk tales were one sort of section of books. The other one was, of course, the space and science books that were very, very popular. The one on the bottom is, I found this in kind of, I think I found it in 8 languages. It's called Suryanshi Var in Hindi, or The Sun's Wind in English. But the space books were quite a strong genre, and you'd see a lot of it kind of chronicling the success of the Soviet Union in direct comparison to where America was in terms of the space race, right? And obviously this is the most expected sort of content of the space books, but then suddenly somewhere in the middle you would have these space books that were sort of looking at the idea of space exploration larger than this sort of competition between these two large nation states. So this is written by, the book itself is written by Alexei Leonov, the cosmonaut, who is leading the Apollo-Soyuz mission, which is where it's what ended the sort of, it brought in an era of friendship between the USSR and America and the USSR. So they launched off these 2 spacecrafts, one from the USSR and one from America, and then the cosmonauts and the astronauts met in midair and shook hands, and that was part of the friendship mission. So this was the book that he wrote about that, and he starts with, "My young friend, the story and the drawings are especially for you. I don't know your name or your age, but I do know that you are a friend, and what can be better than friendship?" And then he goes on to talk about the friendship that he found between the Soviet cosmonauts and the US astronauts. And then he ends this preface with, "Those of my friends who have been in outer space never tire of saying, 'How beautiful is our planet, the Earth.' Do you know why we say so? Because kids like you live on this planet, and we see you from our spaceships. Your smile helps us in those unfathomable voids of no beginning, no end, no top, and no bottom. We know that you follow our flights. In fact, we have the feeling that you are beside us in the spaceship. That is why we try so hard for our flights to come off successfully." And this sort of very sort of expansive and direct way of speaking to the readers left this very deep impression of actually having a connection with the writers of these works. And so Devadatta, the reader I was telling you about, who wrote a letter to the cosmonaut, was in response to this book. And he read it in Marathi. And the interesting thing about the ways in which these books were translated, they weren't the translators who Jessica talks about in her talk as well. They spent a few months initially when they first reached Moscow to learn the Russian language, and then they translated directly from the Russian to Marathi or from the Russian to Bengali. So there wasn't one more layer of sort of language loss when they they weren't looking at English books, and they would often rewrite things to make it more, it wasn't a translation. They were very specific about hiring writers and not translators, so that works were rewritten looking at specific cultural contexts or specific ways of relating, and which is why every translation felt as close and as direct to the readers. In fact, when I was looking at the Progress archives in Moscow, and I was looking at some of the letters to the editor that children wrote, there's this wonderful letter that a child from Pakistan has written to the publishers about how he was really moved and inspired by Lenin's speeches, which he read in Urdu. And only after, a couple of months of reading these speeches, he found out that Lenin doesn't speak Urdu, and he was shocked, So this sort of language didn't only play a role in bringing access to the books, but kind of building a relationship where then the characters felt very much their own. So this is the space and science genre. Then there's this very sort of direct genre of our land is the most amazing land in the world, and we have got it right. So here you see this sort of genre of books. Of course, everything is still explored through the eyes of a child. So the first book on the left, The Seaside Children's Republic, is about Artek, which I'm not sure many of you know of it, but it's this fabulous summer camp that was built in the Soviet Union and had children from all over the world attend. And it had Olympic-sized swimming pool and photo developing rooms and music centers, and it was just the works. And it was really the children who visited the Artek camp were invited, and often were also readers who had written in to the publishers. So in this book, it's this sort of chronicle of one camp, but you see this image of children from all over the world coming together in universal brotherhood, and the Soviet Union allowing for this space or this kind of atmosphere for it to flourish. The second book, We're Flying Across the USSR, is about this child who is from Moscow, but tells his father, oh, the USSR is so large, and shall we take a flight and look at it? And then it's a very aerial view of starting from Ukraine to Moldavia to Belarusia to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and you're kind of looking at what these satellite nations, as they were called, were pre-Soviet Union, and then the ways in which the magic touch of the Soviet Union just made them more prosperous, made them more, equal, fair, happy, whatever. And especially in light of the ways in which, conflicts in that region are sort of developing today, a lot of these narratives are also very interesting to look at, and the ways in which these sort of artificial universality of brotherhood is being sort of constructed as early as then through these books. The last page on the right is again a book called Letters from Friends, where these imaginary children from each of the Soviets write letters to each other about what their Soviets are like. And again, I don't think you can read much here, but this entire game and project is online, so I'm going to let it be for you to kind of explore on the internet. But all of them sort of start with what it was like pre-being part of the Soviet Union, and then the ways in which electricity or industrialization or some kind of new enterprise was introduced, and now life is better. And so this is one sort of theme. And then, of course, Lenin is, this overarching theme that kind of comes up through all of the books. And it was interesting to me because a lot of the ways in which the image of Lenin was constructed was also kind of similar to the ways in which we imagine Nehru growing up. He was this sort of well-dressed but kind, stately man who loved children and was, fond of he had all I can remember we had these stories of, Chacha Nehru, right? And this sort of soft figure who would kneel down and talk to a child, and that's exactly the way in which also the image of Lenin is constructed. And then it's interesting to see, or to kind of speculate, how those matching images were sort of produced in a way. So there are all these stories about how, on Christmas Lenin surprises a group of orphans, or this sort of train of stories. And then, of course, the last theme was very directly about the revolution, about the Red Army and the White Army and the bourgeois and the sort of Bolshevik Revolution or December or whatever. So like very historical material around the establishment of the Soviet Union. So I was kind of looking at all of these different categories of imagery, of books, but I also realized that while the stories were also easy to kind of slot and sub-categorize or understand thematically, there was also something very interesting happening with the visuals as you look at the imagery, because almost all of these books are richly illustrated works. There's just one more little thing. Which I forgot to mention. So before I go into the imagery, I'll tell you a little bit about this, which was that over time I felt like there was this sort of tension or tussle between the world of magic and the rational world that kept coming up through these books, you know. So, for example, you'd have the folk tales or the fairy tales, which were the largest amount of books were of that genre, which are, of course, all about magic. But then you had these books which were kind of a bit snide about magic. So, for example, the one here, I'm just going to read a bit of that. It says, "The time of magicians has passed, and there probably never were any to begin with. They must have been made up to fool very little children." And then, you know, this other sort of story begins. And on the right, you see this poster, which I found in the archive there, which talks about, you know, like on the left are all these fairy tale characters, right? The crocodile and Baba Yaga and whatever. And then it's like let's let go of all of these false characters and make room for a new rational and sensible children's story for the new rational sensible child. So this sort of imagination of like what does the ideal child look like and what does that child consume is also being slowly kind of constructed through the ways in which these stories are being commissioned, written, rewritten, etc. This is about the visual imagery. So I think the visual imagery also could kind of, you know, reflect in some way this tension of the two worlds, of the magical and the rational. So on the one hand, you have these very intricately decorative, lots of detailed motifs, and, you know, lots of like leaning to movements like the Art Nouveau movement or Miros Gustava, or a lot of more folk and decorative art forms within you know, outside of visual art and culture, but also making their way into the storybooks. So for example, these are some embroidered towels that were found in the archive, which is like called this red and white peasant embroidery, doesn't really have another term. And then you see the presence of these motifs as well as these objects in the children's books themselves, you know, as little details, as little borders. So really drawing from physical and tactile forms in sort of what was present in the world around, and then finding them into the children's books. Again, these three dolls at the bottom are again also dolls that I photographed from the archives in Moscow, which were these rag dolls, right, or like straw dolls that were often given to a child by their mother. But then you also see them making their way into the storybook. So, for example, there's a story of Vasilisa, who's been given a doll by her mother before she dies, and then when her father remarries and she has these evil stepsisters or whatever, then the doll becomes her inner guiding voice who kind of helps her when she's in trouble and danger. Similarly, you have this sort of this object of the spinning wheel is something that kind of shows up in a lot of stories where this man proposes to somebody by offering her a handmade spindle. And then you see this object also in the archives. So you're really looking at real life and like what is considered more like folk livelihood objects and practices finding themselves into the storybooks. But then on the other hand, you have the avant-garde graphic design movement, or Malevich's Black Square, or sort of constructivism, and ways in which this sort of completely new visual vocabulary that emerges and also finds itself in some of the children's books illustrations like these. So, I mean, this is just like some of the background information that I wanted to show you, but I think I'm just going to get into the game. But before I get into it, I just wanted to share that I never really set out thinking about what I want to make or what is the outcome of what I want to make. And I think that it's often through the research process and through kind of spending time with material that the form of what I'm going to do with that material emerges. And even for this work, I just knew I wanted to look at the children's books and like spend time with them, and then let's see what happens. And two of the things that I really wanted to do once I reached the end of my research phase was that I didn't really grow up with children's books of this kind, but what I did also grow up with were multimedia and like encyclopedic CD-ROMs, or like these kind of interactive education CD-ROMs that you would kind of click to open something and go through something, and it felt as magical as to me as in the ways in which the children who grew up with these Soviet books would recount to me. And I felt like that form really lent itself to the kind of endless journey that you could take with stories. And the other thing that I found that really stayed with me was this impulse of collecting that I told you about earlier, and about how these collectors got obsessed with this idea of just having these books, whether they read them or not. And I wanted both of these things to be part of the work. So what I've ended up making now is a game, but more than a game, it's just a sea of stories that you can spend time with and explore, and the stories lead from one to the other, but you can also collect all of the original Soviet books within the game and build your own collection or library inside it. These painters were forbidden from painting religious iconography, and so they turned to painting motifs from children's stories. So I've kind of cut and animated several of these books to create this world called Lukomorie. So Pushkin starts his text with this word Lukomorie, and a lot of scholars kind of wonder, what does Lukomorie mean? And there are many interpretations to it, but Lukomorie, universally, a lot of people have agreed on the fact that it is the land where stories originate. And so you can kind of zoom into and look at different details into this work. So for example, here we have the cat that Mrinalini was telling us about earlier. And you have Pushkin here writing. And then you can sort of click on him. I'm not sure if you can read any of that. Let me know. Can you read it? Maybe I can read. Yeah. Okay. And then here you see the Palak miniature painters who are painting the scene that we look at. And if you click on them, so the game is full of these collectible cards, which are archival information and research notes that you can kind of keep looking at, and if you're interested in them, then you flip to read more about them, and if you aren't, then you just close them and move ahead. But this is the story of the lacquer miniature painting that I just told you about. And you kind of just move across this landscape of stories with different characters in them, and you can click on various characters and they just tell you a little micro tale. For example, the frog tells you, I was born wiser and cleverer than my father. This so angered him that he turned me into a frog, and a frog I have to be for 3 years. Or for example, you meet this little girl who's Vasilisa, and she says, before my mother died, she gave me this doll, told me I must keep it with me at all times and tell no one about it, not even my father. Or you have this character here, which is called Rusalkas. We are Rusalkas, maidens who live by the water with long flowing hair and a sad, sad song, tempting men off their path and drowning them too. Some say we are spirits of girls who committed suicide out of disappointed love, or the spirits of babies who died unbaptized. And so this is one of the things that you can do in this scene, which is just explore and see what all of these different characters have to say. But another thing that happens in the scene is that you can find books. So for example, this is a scene of the pioneers, and if you click on them, you find that book that I was telling you about earlier. And then you can kind of flip pages and read the whole book. So there are over 50 books inside the game that you can kind of read and collect as you go. And this is the Artek camp that I was talking about earlier.
Which year is this camp?
Is the book from, let me see. I'm not sure. I'd probably say at the back of the book. Yeah. You can go all the way back. Maybe you can look at it later.
You can look at it.
Yeah. It's a long book. And apart from this, there are a series of stories that I've written using some of the characters that I came across through my research. And those can be accessed, but that's the quest. So, for example, you may click on something and it will be locked, but you can only unlock it, and that's the game, is to kind of go ahead in unlocking all of the different stories and going through the entire journey. So you can unlock it by, in the beginning only one story is unlocked, and then as you proceed you have these tiny challenges or tiny gameplay sort of things to solve that will help you get to the other stories. So this is the very first story, the prologue, that I'm going to play for you. And so these are the cards that you can find through the game, and what happens in the game is when you click on escape, you have this kind of section of the collectibles. So every time you collect a card, it's here in your menu, and then you can go back and read it. And similarly with the books, so the one that we clicked on is collected here, but you have several others to collect. So all of this is being sort of controlled by, the players. You can kind of pace it in the ways that you want. I'm not sure if you can read that. Can you? Okay, I'm going to quickly read it out to you. This is a portrait of Alexei Maximovich Peshko, a man of contradictions. He wrote under the name Maxim Gorky, meaning bitter, and yet had a movingly hopeful quality to his work. He was publicly opposed to the Tsarist regime and yet spent time in exile outside Russia and later the Soviet Union. He had close relations to the Stalinist regime, where he was named the president of the Union of Soviet Writers and yet was placed under house arrest towards the end of his life. At the first All-Union Congress of Soviet Writers in 1934, a path-breaking conference that influenced children's writing for decades, he introduced socialist realism as the official state-sanctioned aesthetic, but also made a case for folklore. Like I said, a man of contradictions. And that dialogue box says, I guess you all have a point, but the more pressing question is, where are we and why are we all together in the same story? And that's sort of the beginning of the game.
It's not over.
How are we doing for time? We can keep going for a bit more?
yeah,
Okay.
I think you definitely keep
Okay.
going. There's lots people.
Okay. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the title, because a lot of the Western children's stories begin with Once Upon a Time in a Land Far, Far Away. And a lot of the Soviet, or the more, I guess not only the Soviet, but the Slavic folktales, begin with whether this happened a long time ago or not so long ago, whether this really happened or not, nobody knows for certain. And I just really love that kind of ambiguity in beginning of a tale. And that's something I also really wanted to bring into this project, because were these children books the product of a relationship between one state and the other? Yes. Was there an underlying propaganda as part of that impetus? Yes. But did it also do other things for children? Was there a life of these stories that existed beyond the intentions for which they existed? And I feel like there's a lot of truth and ambiguity, and I'm kind of trying not to fix any of these moments in history as one thing or the other, but kind of looking at the game as a way for multiple realities to exist simultaneously. And you'll see a bit more of this refrain as we go through. So yeah, this is sort of the beginning of the game. I'm going to skip through the reading part because it's not that much fun. I don't know why I can't hear any of the... There's supposed to be music and audio here, but it seems to have disappeared. Yeah, it's playing off my computer. Can you hear? Yeah, something's gone wrong with the cable, I think. Yeah.
If you go to sound, system preferences or something, select
Yeah, we tried this multiple times, but it isn't working for some reason. Yeah. Maybe I'm just going to play it off my computer audio.
Play it off the computer audio after, and I think we can anyway appreciate the visuals.
Okay. Yeah. I don't think you can hear anything right now, though, right? Okay. Tried that. It wasn't working. Yeah, we tried that too. It wasn't working. It doesn't do anything. Anyway, so you can click on a portal to move from this scene to any other scene. Do you want to tell me where you want me to click? I can be the player and you can instruct the sun. This kind of, I don't want to become like too ready, so I'm gonna let it be, but you can sort of read it. But it's about this idea of what is propaganda, looking at the children's books here. You can also kind of zoom into this trap, and then all of these books are readable. So for example, you click on any book, and it kind of tells you a little bit about the book and which collector I digitized it from, and then you can kind of read the entire story.
So the full books are available?
The full books are available inside the game. And it's really also trying to kind of look at what can an archive look like, you know, and so the game then becomes an archive for the book. This is the famous chicken gag. This is a really great blog if anyone is interested in reading more of the Bangla Soviet children's books. It's sovietbooksandbengali.blogspot.com. It has a great collection. I have two what are considered rare books here. One is a book in Gurumukhi. Will I add more books?
Add more books to the collection here?
Can you? Yeah, I think so. Yeah, sure. I mean, I could. I mean, I have a lot more books that I haven't put in here. It's just that it becomes a very heavy file, and then people don't want to download like very large files. So. No. Within the game, yeah. The game is available on a game website called itch.io. But you can just Google "nobody knows for certain" and perhaps my name. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's not a mobile app. It's a PC game. Yeah. No, you can't read on a mobile. It's too heavy. Yeah. This is another rare book. There weren't that many Urdu books actually. And Patna seems to have the largest collection, strangely, of Urdu books right now. Okay. And then I'm just going to click away. One takes kind of a long journey through some of the popular spots in which the books were sold and the publishers or book houses that were associated with those places. But I'm gonna help you solve this one, and maybe the next one you can tell me how to solve it. So this is the portal into the next scene. Yeah. So even the artwork for most of the levels are directly from the children's books or drawing from the language of a particular moment in the children's book illustrations and then adding my own drawings into it. So, for example, this story of the tale of the cat without a tail is actually coming from a tradition called the Lubbock prints, which was an earlier predecessor for children's books illustrations. There were these woodcuts that were done almost like Kalighat paintings, very tongue-in-cheek commentary of what was happening at the time, and chapbook logic, and they had this very particular kind of perspective and colors that were used. So I was really so some of them, for example, this girl is from the original, and so is this border, and then I drew the rest of the scene to kind of, to imagine what it would look like if it was made in a chapbook style. So you can kind of use your arrow keys and make this cat walk around and talk to different people. And then your next task as a player is you have to find the way out of this room where everyone's being really mean to this cat. And I'm just going to solve it for you now. You basically get out of it from here. So this is referencing a really popular Lubbock print, which you can find out about when you click on a card. I haven't been collecting cards, but all this while there have been information cards hidden everywhere. But for example, I'm going to read this one out to you because it's really nice. The policies of Peter the Great were a popular theme of satire in Lubbock prints. He was often depicted as a cat, with images accompanied by text. For example, the cat of Kazan and the man of Astrakhan, by reason of Siberia, lives gloriously, manages agreeably, and farts sweetly. Lubbock prints poked fun at his lengthy titles, or how, after a trip to Louis XVI's clean-shaved court, he issued an edict forcing Russians either to cut off their beards or pay an annual tax. the cat has reached India. And I really wanted this scene to kind of also be referencing what was the other visual imagery that we as children grew up with around the same time, and it was, I guess, Tinkle Comics. So I've kind of drawn out a lot of the characters from Tinkle into this world that the cat enters into. Do you want to tell me where you want me to click?
You are the elderly gentleman.
Okay. He says, yeah, so that's your game challenge. Help me pass the time by counting 5 tokens of Indo-Soviet friendship in this scene. And you have a score bar here, 0 out of 5. So not the books, anything but the books. Because the books we already know.
The radio.
Okay. Yeah, you got one. And then here, of course, is about the Radio Moscow Enterprise. So 1 out of 5. The towers? No. The statue. Yeah. Okay, you got 2. Come on, guys. The kid. The scooter. Got it. And this is about the slogan. That's it. Yeah, you can click.
On the cover.
Yeah, this was a poster.
Can we click on the cricket bat?
No.
It's big.
No, but this boy does. Yeah. So this is a small history of the Matryoshka doll. No. No. Okay, I'm just gonna click. Of course. So all of these books, when you click on them, they're readable like any other book everywhere. I mean, through the game, if you see a book, you can click on it and you can read it.
Books are not for.
Yeah, the books are the books. But if you click on the boy, you go into the next mini game.
So are these different books on every?
Yeah. So this scene, for example, has only books on space and science because that's what the character of this child likes. So here there's a little mini game, but I'm going to play it for you because it's a little hard to get directions for it. But it's an imagined scrapbook of a boy who grew up obsessed with books about space. And I've just really made a scrapbook using some of the original books and cutting out some of the text and images, etc. And you can kind of just decorate the scrapbook in whatever way you like and add to it or whatever. But there are some parts in the book that he hasn't filled out, and you have to solve it. So what is the balloon of the Montgolfier brothers, for example? And then you can kind of search and add and then move ahead. And so you have to complete the scrapbook in order to move ahead in the story. So for example, you need to add a Sputnik, and if you add something else that's not a Sputnik, it's not going to catch. And that's a Sputnik. And it's really nice to actually spend time with this scrapbook also outside of solving it, because you really also see what is the narrative of this imagination of the world outside of our world that's being explored through the books for children. And it's quite beautiful. Yeah. So this is Yuri Gagarin. Yeah, you think? No. That's Yuri. Yeah.
We should round up now so that we can take a photo.
Sure. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly solve this so that we can end. There you go.
Greetings from India to you all. We saw the launching of your spacecraft with fascination. We share your excitement. Yours is a historic endeavor. I hope it will make our country space conscious and inspire our young people to be more adventurous. हमारे देशवासी, हमारा पार्लियामेंट और व्यक्तिगत रूप से मैं आप और आपके सह अंतरिक्ष यात्रियों कर्नल यूरी मालेशियम और श्री गेनादी स्टेकलोव की सफलता और सुरक्षित वापसी की प्रार्थना करते हैं। आप सबको मेरी शुभकामनाएं। जय हिंद।
आपको धन्यवाद देते हैं, आपकी बधाई के तबियत बिल्कुल ही अच्छी है, जरूरत से ज़्यादा खा रहे हैं हम।
ऊपर से भारत कैसा दिखता है आपको?
एक बगैर स्थिति झिझक के कह सकता हूँ कि सारे जहां से अच्छा।
आपकी उड़ान
Iconic.
भारत और सोवियत संघ के बीच मैत्री की एक सुंदर मिसाल है।
I'm just going to show you one quick last scene before I stop. Because you haven't met the second primary character in the story yet. And I'll stop here. Should we get the lights? Thank you.
I don't think we take questions because
Yeah.
it's gone on for a long time.
Yeah, we can just chat
Unless there's just one or
informally.
two things that people would like to know a bit more about the research.
Yeah.
Chat informally outside, I guess.
Thank you, Afra, for a really wonderful evening, and I think a fantastic nostalgic trip actually for so many of us, taking us back to these childhood stories and books. And as I said, there's a little tribute by me also at that reading corner over there. And I hope this evening gets all of you to go back home, look at the libraries you have over there, re-engage with the stories you grew up with, but also the authors, the friends, the parents who were your first storytellers. I'm also glad that somewhere this particular event has happened at the time of the book fair, because I think, of course, we didn't go in depth, but the People's Publishing House, in fact, is something that you saw over there. And it's also time to recognize the publishers and the translators and the kind of commendable job that they did in bringing these books to us. I'm sure, as I said, there's fodder for so many more histories to come out of this. I remember, in fact, in the previous presentation that we saw of yours, you also delved deeply into a lot of the illustrators and the illustration styles that kind of you found across this. But as I said, like, we could go on probably for the rest of the night also with Afra asking her questions. Having said that, I do want to keep like a short question and answer round, because I know some people might have a few things to ask her. Those of you, of course, who are in a rush, please, there's some tea, there's still some snacks there, so please, in fact, help yourself. But if there are people up for questions and answers, then we can take a few over here and you can respond to those. And and as I said, my mom's also mentioned, this game is downloadable on other systems, and I'm sure everybody will want to spend a lot more time going through it in detail. So that's the great part of, like, sharing and building this world together. But thank you everybody, and thank you Jodhunath Bhavan for also allowing us once again to host a really lovely memorial event, to Mithunda, who last minute in fact agreed to do a video of this whole event, and we'll be able to share this recording with a lot of people who weren't able to attend as well.
I have two stories to share, which are directly related to Afra's presentation.
Right. And you finish those, and then we'll take questions for 10 minutes maybe, and then call it a
two small
evening.
stories. I think I mentioned this. My brother was born in 1961, and my parents were determined to call him Yuri, because it was the year Yuri Gagarin landed. And the other story is about Hari, and you were talking about the children's fascination with the figure of Nehru. Now, Hari grew up in Nehruvian India and ever since, born in 52. And I always thought of him as the ultimate Nehruvian, because those who knew him, he wore the Nehru jacket too. But one of the stories he shared with me was how, when he was growing up in Bangalore, his father was a defense scientist. He would, on his way to school, write the little notes to Chacha Nehru and would insist on putting them into a postbox. I don't think they ever reached anyone, but it's a small story which I wanted to leave with all of you. So we take a few questions if you want. A lot of Bengalis were called Bulganin. That's the year he visited. Lots of people born in 1955. I once met somebody on a Rajdhani Express, and he said, "Amanna Bulganin Vishas." I immediately knew which year he was born. Okay, we can pass this mic around.
We can pass the mic around.
Vimli.
Anybody? Maybe I can, and then I'll ask one question.
Thank you for the excellent presentation. I'm Amito from APP. I have a simple question. How do you plan to take it forward so that it can reach more people? What are the plans for that?
Well, it's on the internet, and
Because I'd love to have this reach out to more people so that they can see it.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes feel like as artists and makers, we spend so much time and sweat and energy making something, and then to also bear the burden of then distributing it is like too much. So I feel like if you like it, you share it, and everyone in this room will further share it, and then hopefully it will find the other people who would want to see it. No?
What's the economics of it?
It's a good question. Yeah, it's a good one. Actually, the economics of this particular project, and of course it varies from project to project, is that I had my research entirely supported by the museum in Moscow, and then there wasn't a plan to translate that into a work. It was supposed to be a paper presentation or like an evening of just talking about the research, but I think that the depth of the findings were quite exciting for both me as well as the museum, and then they created a grant within their they have a digital platform as part of the museum, so they created a grant within that to support the production of this work. So it was entirely supported by the museum. However, I ran out of funds halfway, so the game is currently in part 1. It stops smack in the middle, although I do have the script and the material for the rest of it. I just don't have the money to make it. So part of the hope is that people like it and support finds its way to me to continue making it. But apart from that, in terms of the material in it, the copyright for the books actually is quite ambiguous because it's state-owned and the state no longer exists. And so that really helped using large amounts of material that would not have been possible to use in any other context. And then also the material that I used from other archives and museums in Moscow, the Garage Museum bought the rights for that material. So in that way, that's kind of how it worked in terms of the economics of it.
Thank you. Amazing artwork. I don't know who did it, but fabulous. Yeah, you did all of it.
I mean, the bulk of the material are from the original story, the illustrations from the children's stories, and all of the illustrations that I've used, you'll also find those storybooks within the game. So you would be able to recognize at some point, oh, okay, this scene comes from here. But a lot of it is also, one tiny flower from somewhere and one fish from somewhere, and kind of stitching a lot of them together and then drawing in the style of or in the language of that particular illustration to create the rest of the scene. Yeah.
Just congratulations.
There's a question.
Hi, but this was so amazing and expansive. I'm so excited to go in.
It's fine.
Yeah? No?
It's not. I don't think it's on, but it's fine. I can hear you.
It's fine, it's fine.
Yeah, I can hear you. It's
So
okay.
I guess this might have been covered initially, and I hope not. But I was curious about what led to children's stories being such an is such an important medium in Soviet Union, because every country has different mediums, I guess. And I was just curious about what led to children's stories being that.
Yeah, I think it's like a long answer, and also the breadth of Jessica's research also in some way. But I think it wasn't only children's literature, it was all kinds of literature, and I was only focusing on the children's. So the wealth that you see here also extends to other literatures and non-fiction writing that came from the Soviet Union to India. But of course, within the Soviet Union also there was a heavy sort of importance laid on the idea of the child, because it was the new nation and it was the new citizen that would then inherit this new nation, and how do you frame and mold that consciousness in some way,
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, keep passing the mic, please.
And there's one by Shobi.
Shobi, there's more that side. Okay. Oh, wait. Okay.
Hi. Okay, so I had the pleasure of actually seeing this work and playing the game when it was physically installed in a space in Dhaka last week, and in the physical installation of the work it was in a dark room, and there was a wallpaper that was pasted on the walls with actual letters that you had found in the archives of Indian readers writing to the publishers, and you found the actual letters. So are those letters in the game at some point, or do they exist mostly in this physical installation of the work? And I'm kind of interested a little bit in, are you thinking more about physical ways in which you can install this work in museums and other libraries or something like that?
So all of the archival material will eventually find itself in the game. So for example, the stamps or the Hindi Rusi Bhai Bhai found itself in that scene where you find it as a hidden item. So similarly, there is a scene of a child in India writing a pen pal letter to a child in Moscow, and then we travel to the post office, and there we not only see the letters of pen pal children going back and forth, but also the letters to the publisher, as well as the game right now in part 1 ends in India, and part 2 begins in Moscow, which is what I'm working on and hopefully will make. And there I also really wanted to bring in what is the reality of this ideal land that's been constructed through the stories. And in the archives I also found a lot I was looking at the idea of correspondence and letters, and there's this large space of letters that remain undelivered because people had disappeared, and I was looking at the idea of disappearances within the Soviet Union. So there's a scene of the post office where you not only see those letters that were in the physical install, but also the idea of what was it like to be a citizen in the Soviet Union, and exploring that through letters. And there are many other archival findings and sort of these little gems that I have, and I'm holding on to, and I haven't been able to use in this particular part of the game. But there's also a beautiful archive of embroidery, where you see a lot of the older fairy tale motifs, especially around marriage, within those embroideries, because they were things that women stitched for themselves as their own dowry or whatever, part of their marriage chest. And so that finds itself into a story in part 2, as well as mourning songs that were...
Where did you find these textiles? In the garage museum?
No, not at the garage. There were about 18 different institutions that we visited, and they're all enlisted within the game, so they all come from different places. And about the ways in which this work would kind of... Yeah, I think that it's always nice for somebody to encounter the work in a physical space, and kind of like, what does it mean to sit in person in a room, but also then just disappear from that space and kind of into this world of stories. And I always think that it's nice to encounter it in that way and then go back and visit it, or know that it exists on the internet for you to live by. And I think that every time you show it, you understand or learn something more about what ways it works in terms of a physical space. So yeah, I definitely think I want to explore. I'd like to explore more ways of, and more places to even like show this work as a wouldn't say like an installation, but a place to play.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know, the exhibition that's in Dhaka right now is going to travel to Delhi.
Yeah,
in
to
June.
I don't think we have a date, maybe June or July.
Yeah,
but
and the game will be part of that exhibition at Kiranadar Museum.
Yeah.
Shobhi.
Shobhi, 2 more questions this side. Yeah.
We just take Shobhi and one more.
Hi, that's one of the best design games I've seen in my life. And
And
so many.
he works on digital games.
Wow.
And I
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just wanted to ask, there's been a lot of debate about whether video games can tell stories at all. So I'm intrigued by your decision to use a video game really to tell the story, and it does tell a story so well. So why did you choose the video game medium? And do you see any challenges in using the video game medium to tell a story, and what are the advantages really that you saw in using the video game?
But what I also really love about video games or the interactive digital format is the simultaneity of it. Unlike a film or a video in itself, linearity doesn't necessarily need to exist. You can go on multiple paths and take multiple directions, and I think that the experience really differs based on who the person controlling the narrative is, and what kind of paths that they decide to take, or what mood you are in that moment that you'd like to play. And I feel like that's something I'm interested in exploring formally, especially when it comes to storytelling, And how do you tell a very, very long story in one sitting? You don't actually, you always continue. And I mean, the 1001 Arabian Nights stories, goes on night after night. And stories are like a mycelium, like one sprout somewhere, but also leads to 3 other sprouts. And I think that the game format really lends itself to that way of storytelling. The challenges of it, I think, are just, for me, it was the first time I was making a game, and I think I just had a very steep learning curve, because I've made video, I've done some amount of code, but I've never worked in a game engine, and it's another beast. Like, you have to rewire your brain to think in a certain way. And I also think that's the reason why the money ran out, because I just didn't realize like how much time it takes and how complicated processes can get. And this like world of bugs that keep resurfacing and are so gritty.
It could be the rationality versus superstition debate where they felt nobody knows for certain, but right?
I think it predates the rationality though. Like it's just a refrain of storytelling, perhaps.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Can you just spell out the website name from where?
Yeah, it's called itch.io. Yeah. You can also just Google my name.
Nobody knows for certain.
Yeah. It comes up. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll just say some, there is again another round of tea and food. Please join us if you're not in a great hurry. I take this occasion to thank particularly the staff. Today is a weekend, but Vivekananda, Shoshti and Mrinal have come today specially for this event. Mithun, who came at very short notice, thank you Mithun. Kamalika and Shujan, who helped a lot with the technical work. Shujan had to leave. And all of you for being with us today and remembering Hari with us.